In 1955, a 12-year-old girl was rushed into a hospital in a deep coma after ingesting aspirin, sleeping pills, and gin all at once. When she regained consciousness, she temporarily lost her hearing and eyesight. Her body was exhausted, her psyche shattered. That girl was Tuesday Weld, a name Hollywood would later whisper with equal parts desire and fear. From that moment on, Tuesday Weld's life split into two opposing parallel layers. On one side was innate talent, a beauty the camera could not look away from, and invitations from Hitchcock, Kubrick, Polanski, Elvis Presley. On the other was a mind constantly fracturing, pushed into the role of a young sex symbol before she had time to grow up, branded a bad girl while still a teenager, and gradually becoming a name that Hollywood itself no longer quite knew what to do with. Tuesday Weld never lacked opportunities to become a superstar. What she lacked, or deliberately refused, was the price of absolute fame. When she turned down roles in some of the most iconic films in cinema history, the public called it a mistake. When she stepped away from the spotlight at the very moment she was nominated for an Oscar, the press called it self-destruction. But what happens when a child is turned into a legend before she ever has the chance to become a person? The story of Tuesday Weld is not merely the journey of a gifted actress. It is the quiet tragedy of someone who survived Hollywood, but never allowed herself to be conquered by it. The moment the girl regained consciousness after her coma at the age of 12 was not the beginning of the tragedy. It was merely the first time that everything long suppressed was forced to break the surface. Long before the name Tuesday Weld appeared on movie posters or in Hollywood columns, her life had already settled into a rigid rhythm, one that left no room for prolonged innocence. Susan Kerr Weld was born in 1943 in New York, the youngest of 3 children. She carried the Weld surname, a name associated with old East Coast American privilege, families linked to Harvard and the intellectual elite. Yet inside the house where Susan grew up, that name offered almost no protection. Her father, Lathrop Motley Weld, was an anomaly within the lineage. Unstable, dependent on alcohol, reckless with money, and never truly able to stand firm as a provider. Her mother, Yosine Balfour Kerr, a woman who had grown up orphaned, entered that marriage with very little emotional or financial cushioning for herself or for her children. When Susan was 8 years old, her father died of a heart attack. His death did not merely remove a parent, it exposed the fragility of the family's entire structure. The burden fell on a widowed mother raising 3 children, while support from the wealthy paternal relatives came only with harsh, detached conditions. In that atmosphere, Susan absorbed a truth she could sense long before she could name it. Nothing was stable, and safety could vanish at any moment. That lack soon became materially visible. The family slipped into financial hardship, and the choices that followed were dictated not by Susan, but by necessity. Her striking face became a means of survival. Before the age of 12, Susan was already working like an adult, appearing regularly in photo shoots and television programs. Hollywood did not present itself as a dream to chase, but as a compulsory escape, one that kept the family from falling further. Childhood, as a result, was not abruptly taken away. It was slowly worn down in silence, day by day. It was within this boundaryless work environment, where the concept of protecting minors barely existed, that Susan encountered a life-defining trauma. While still underage, she was sexually assaulted by an adult directly connected to her work. Someone from a world she was expected to trust, cooperate with, and obey. There were no reports, no discussions, no mechanisms for questioning what had happened. The incident was neither denied nor acknowledged. It was simply pushed aside, like so many other unspeakable things in Hollywood at the time. For a child already living with a deep sense of insecurity, that violation was not just an isolated physical or psychological injury. It was the collapse of an already fragile idea of safety. Susan was given no explanation, no permission to react. Silence became the only message. This was the price, and the best response was to carry on. From that point on, signs of distress began to surface. Persistent anxiety, unexplained depressive states, and the early use of alcohol and sedatives as a way to regulate feeling, even though she was still a child. Her young body and mind could not endure that pressure indefinitely. At the age of 9, Susan suffered a severe nervous breakdown, a clear indication that her internal defenses had reached their limit. Yet instead of being treated as a warning, the collapse was dismissed as a temporary malfunction to be pushed through. By the time she reached 14 or 15, the cracks had not disappeared. They had only changed form. On the outside was a face in growing demand. On the inside was a quiet exhaustion that had to be hidden so the machine would not stop. Her hospitalization for psychological treatment during this period revealed how far her condition had deteriorated. And yet the paradox remained. At the very moment Susan needed to be recognized as a wounded child, Hollywood imposed the opposite image, a young, alluring muse, seemingly untouched by ordinary limits. These two images existed side by side, never intersecting, with Susan trapped in between. In that void, a child continued to grow up too fast, not out of ambition, but because survival left no alternative. From that unstable foundation, her deeper entanglement with the entertainment industry became increasingly locked in place. Not by personal choice, but by events that had unfolded long before Susan was old enough to understand what she was being asked to give up. From that unstable foundation, Susan's entry into acting did not unfold as an aspirational choice, but rather as a natural continuation of a long process of adaptation that had begun far too early. Her first television roles in New York came while she was still in her early teens. Mostly small parts, brief appearances, but enough for people in the industry to notice something unusual. Susan possessed an on-camera presence that far exceeded her age. In 1956, Alfred Hitchcock cast her in a fleeting appearance in The Wrong Man. It was only a cameo, yet for a director famously exacting about visual intuition, the decision itself was an early signal. Susan carried a kind of cinematic energy that was difficult to define, fragile, yet unsettling. That same year, Rock moved Susan from the margins of the screen closer to the center of attention. Her role was not extensive in screen time, but it provoked a reaction no one on the production truly controlled. Critics began to reach for a troubling label, archetypal nymphet. What made that label heavy was not the wording itself, but the reality behind it. When Susan played a teenager with erotic undertones, she was, in fact, younger than the character she portrayed, while her male co-stars were already adults. That imbalance created discomfort for more perceptive viewers, yet Hollywood treated it as a distinctive quality worth exploiting. For Susan, this was the first moment she understood that her body and image were being interpreted in ways entirely beyond her control. By 1958, Susan left New York and relocated fully to Hollywood, carrying with her both unnamed wounds and a fragile, newly formed reputation. Rally Round the Flag, Boys, starring Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, marked the real turning point. The film placed her firmly within the orbit of major studios, not merely because of its cast, but because of her presence on screen. Susan stood out without competing for attention, without overt display. Yet it was here that the central contradiction began to surface. Producers saw in her a moldable type, while Susan, despite her youth, started to feel the pressure of being boxed in. The roles were written as innocent, but the camera lingered on her face in ways that suggested something else, as though Hollywood either did not know or chose not to know how old she actually was. In 1959, when Susan signed her first major film contract and officially entered mainstream Hollywood, events accelerated to a pace that left her little room to breathe. Opportunities arrived in rapid succession, but so did a label that had formed far too early. Rather than being approached first as a young actress with promise, Susan increasingly found herself treated as an image, simultaneously desired and mistrusted. Her talent was undeniable, yet the shadow of the nymphet began to hover over every role, turning each career move into a quiet struggle between her acting ability and the way Hollywood insisted on seeing her. While Hollywood hesitated between exploiting or restraining Susan's image, American television made an experimental choice, one that became the first true test of her professional limits. CBS cast her in The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, not because she fit the mold of a wholesome family sitcom, but because of something far less measurable: chemistry. On paper, Susan's character was simply one of several romantic interests orbiting the male lead. On screen, however, her presence immediately disrupted the balance. She did not perform like a predictable young ingenue, nor did she blend into the safe, regulated rhythm favored by American television at the time. That very disruption quickly became a source of backstage tension. The working relationship between Susan and lead actor Dwayne Hickman was never truly smooth. Hickman was accustomed to the rigid, repetitive discipline of sitcom production, while Susan carried an energy that resisted containment, not out of unprofessionalism, but because she did not reshape herself to fit a pre-designed frame. On set, this difference was not treated as a creative divergence, but gradually reframed as a problem of attitude. Susan came to be seen as someone who failed to embody the family spirit the show was meant to project. The breaking point emerged from a scene that seemed minor on the surface. In a segment featuring Warren Beatty, the dialogue and exchanged glances between the characters were deemed by sponsors to exceed what was acceptable for family viewing hours. No public outrage was required. Internal complaints alone were enough to activate television's self-protective mechanisms. To advertisers, Susan ceased to be a promising young actress and instead became an uncontrollable variable in a product that demanded absolute safety. When the decision was made, it came swiftly and cleanly. Susan was removed from the series after a single season. There was no official condemnation, no loud scandal in the conventional sense. But within Hollywood's unspoken language, the message was unmistakable. A young actress once sought after for her difference was now being marked in producers' notebooks, not for lack of talent, but because her image was judged difficult to manage. For Susan, this was the first time she understood that in this industry, a role could succeed on screen and still become evidence against the person who performed it. Susan's fall from Dobie Gillis did not make Hollywood hesitate. On the contrary, it accelerated her movement into a sequence of projects where the risk was embedded in the very structure of production. In 1960, she appeared in Sex Kittens Go to College, a film savaged by critics upon release. What proved disturbing was not its artistic failure, but the studio's strategy for selling tickets. Sexually explicit scenes were shot later and inserted into a version marketed to adult audiences. In that process, an actress still under 18 was involuntarily drawn into an adult cut, not through personal choice, but through purely commercial decisions. Public criticism targeted the face on the poster, while systemic responsibility dissolved somewhere between the editing room and distribution meetings. Before she could escape that orbit, 1961 brought the private lives of Adam and Eve. This time, backlash extended beyond critics to religious institutions. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned the film, and in the United Kingdom, it was denied theatrical exhibition. The consequences spread faster than the film itself. The bad girl image hardened into a fixed label, while the chain of decisions, script, editing, release strategy, remained entirely outside the young actress's control. Susan was pushed into the storm and then left alone with consequences she had not created. As controversy piled up, the heavenly doors that seemed within reach closed with clinical coldness. That same year, Susan appeared opposite Elvis Presley in Wild in the Country. Rumors of closeness between them circulated quickly, but the decisive response came from Colonel Tom Parker, the strict guardian of Elvis's image. In Parker's brand management logic, Susan was categorized as a risk, and the connection was severed before it could become anything more. For Susan, it was another lesson. Scandal, even when generated by others, could still block opportunity. In 1962, professional drama peaked when Stanley Kubrick offered Susan the central role in Lolita. Her refusal, accompanied by a remark that became legend, closed off a path that might have returned her to the A-list. The role went to Sue Lyon. The film was celebrated, and Susan's trajectory slipped out of the industry's preferred lane. In later years, Roman Polanski considered her for Rosemary's Baby and Macbeth, but studios chose otherwise. Again, decisions unrelated to her acting ability. Rather than continuing to collide with closed doors, Susan chose withdrawal from the spotlight. Her time in Greenwich Village was not an attempt at image rehabilitation, but a reconstruction of self, detaching from labels and from the scandal loop. When she returned, she attempted something far more difficult: letting the work speak. The Cincinnati Kid, alongside Steve McQueen, marked her first mature role to be taken seriously without controversy. On television, The Crucible with George C. Scott further shifted critical perception from an image liability to an actress capable of carrying heavy internal conflict without noise. From the moment Susan turned away from the predictable box office route, her career entered a different orbit, quieter, but sharper and more dangerous artistically. In 1968, Pretty Poison became the first real test of this phase. The film was shot amid backstage chaos, with Susan repeatedly clashing with director Noel Black, whose inexperience left him unable to manage the psychological complexity of the female lead. On set, Anthony Perkins inadvertently became a creative translator, mediating between fragmented direction and something Susan could anchor herself to. The result on screen was a character both innocent and ruthless, deeply unstable. Yet upon release, the film coincided with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, and audiences turned away from dark narratives. Pretty Poison failed commercially, but years later, that very misalignment elevated it to cult classic status, with Susan's performance reread as one of the most unsettling female portraits in post-1960s American cinema. With Play It As It Lays, Susan ventured deeper into deliberate emptiness. Maria Wyeth, a woman living in Hollywood yet emotionally detached, required no climaxes, no surface tragedy. The fractures resided in extended silences, in eyes that sought no salvation. The role mirrored layers Susan had accumulated through years of being misread, misinterpreted, and boxed in. Critics responded strongly, and the Golden Globe nomination arrived not because of revenue or market appeal, but because of the performance's chilling precision. In 1977, Looking for Mr. Goodbar placed Susan in an even more precarious position, a supporting role that refused to be forgotten. Alongside Diane Keaton's central character, Susan created a quiet counterforce, an unsettling presence that rendered the story of sexuality and risk heavier rather than titillating. The screen time was limited, but each appearance left an aftershock, earning her an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. At that point, the industry was forced to acknowledge that, despite all prior controversy, she had become a serious actress in the strictest sense. By Once Upon a Time in America, Susan appeared in a film that was both commercially successful and widely regarded as a masterpiece of American cinema. It offered a rare chance to re-enter the mainstream, yet she did not seize it in the way Hollywood expected. Instead of using the success to rejoin the star race, she maintained distance from the box office machine, as if accustomed to standing just outside the spotlight. In Susan's career logic, the peak was never numerical. It lay in whether each role left a cut, deep enough to resist being smoothed over by time or taste. As Susan's performances increasingly revealed how poorly she fit Hollywood's familiar mold, another layer of narrative began to form, one that came not from films, but from the way the media interpreted and assigned meaning to her silence. From the early 1960s onward, the American press began circulating a line attributed to Tuesday Weld: "I hate Hollywood." There was no press conference to confirm it, no accompanying shock statement, yet a pattern of repeated behavior, turning down major roles, avoiding promotional events, limiting interviews, was enough to turn the line into an accepted piece of hearsay. In the public imagination, Susan became a rare case, a star who seemed openly contemptuous of the system that had created her. The label anti-Hollywood star clung to her relentlessly, whether she claimed it or not. At the same time, an uncomfortable anecdote spread through casting circles. People began calling it the Tuesday Weld pattern. Whenever a project showed signs of becoming a major hit, Susan's name would surface, then vanish. Offers stalled at the negotiation table, contracts went unsigned, or she withdrew at the last minute. No single explanation ever prevailed. To outsiders, the phenomenon was baffling, even irritating. To those who had worked with her, it resembled an instinct for self-preservation more than any calculated strategy. That ambiguity fed public curiosity while quietly heightening producers' wariness. By the 1970s, another assessment circulated among critics. Susan was too intelligent to survive in Hollywood. It was not simple praise, but a way of describing an actress who dissected roles down to their core, who refused to just get it done, who resisted smoothing characters into market-friendly shapes. Auteur directors were drawn to this rigor. Commercially driven producers, by contrast, regarded it as a liability. After Pretty Poison, 1968, the stories grew darker. The press repeated claims that some viewers had written letters saying they were afraid to meet Susan in real life because her character felt too cold, too dangerous, too real. There was no verifiable evidence, but the tale circulated often enough to become a metaphor for a diffuse anxiety. When a performance is convincing enough, the boundary between actor and character begins to blur in the public imagination. All of this helped sustain another rumor, quieter but with lasting weight, that Susan had been placed on a kind of soft blacklist. There was no ban, no official document, just a gradual loss of priority, a decision not to push her as a mass-market icon. She continued to work steadily and was invited into selective projects, but the central spotlight always stepped back by 1 degree. Even with Play It As It Lays, 1972, critics whispered that Susan understood Maria Wyeth more deeply than the director did, and that several key moments survived the edit because of her intuition. The anecdote reinforced an image of quiet, creative authority, no raised voice, no overt control, yet strong enough to shape the final outcome. And then, as Susan nearly withdrew from the light altogether, no comeback tour, no memoir, no talk shows, no Netflix-style revival, the media assigned her cold epithets, Hollywood's ghost, the actress who disappeared on purpose, not because a public catastrophe swept her away, but because someone who had once stood at the center deliberately unplugged the light, leaving behind a void that Hollywood found both unsettling and impossible to forget. Even as Susan gradually stepped away from the spotlight and refused to become part of Hollywood's familiar mythology, the old stories refused to release her. The media kept rewinding the clock, repeatedly invoking relationships that had been turned into symbols of her supposed deviance, as if her private life were the final piece of evidence needed to explain why Susan Weld would not follow the path Hollywood had laid out for her. Among these, the name that provoked the strongest reaction was always John Ireland. When that relationship came to light, Susan was barely 16, while Ireland was already in his 40s. The press at the time showed little interest in the power imbalance or the lack of protection surrounding a minor in the industry. Instead, the story was quickly reframed as a moral label. Susan was portrayed as a dangerous seductress, while the responsibility of the grown man all but slipped out of the frame. That mode of coverage did more than spark momentary outrage. It shaped how the public would see her for years. Not long after, rumors linking Susan to Frank Sinatra spread through entertainment columns in the early 1960s. With Sinatra, Hollywood's embodiment of masculine power, the story was told as a charming anecdote of romance. With Susan, it further reinforced the image of a young woman who had entered the adult world too early. The asymmetry in how the media cast their roles was never stated outright, yet it was always present. With Elvis Presley, the story took on a different tone, a rumored closeness during the filming of Wild in the Country, 1961, that never had time to become anything concrete before being cut short by Colonel Tom Parker. In Parker's brand management logic, Susan, with her accumulated controversies, was deemed an unacceptable risk to the Elvis brand. Once again, the decision was not hers to make, yet the consequences fell squarely on her name. What is striking is that, over time, these relationships were no longer recalled to tell stories of affection or intimacy, but to sustain a familiar narrative. That Susan Weld never stayed within the role Hollywood wanted her to play. And that narrative, repeated endlessly, regardless of context or age, helped turn her private life into an inseparable part of the legend of a star who once stood at the center, then deliberately stepped away from the light. Those earlier noisy relationships left Susan not only with the residue of rumor, but with a profound exhaustion. Each time her private life was pulled into Hollywood's orbit of power, she was the one pushed to the margins. It was in that state of mind that she met Claude Harz. Quietly, without spotlights, without names large enough to swallow every other story. Claude was not a star. He worked behind the camera, wrote scripts, and was accustomed to structure, rhythm, and control, rather than the chaos of fame. For Susan, the relationship offered something entirely different from what she had known before. Not pursuit, not dominance, but the illusion of a space where one could breathe. Their decision to marry was not tied to media frenzy. It resembled a quiet attempt to build a life detached from the logic of extraction and disposal she knew all too well. Marriage placed Susan in a role Hollywood had rarely allowed her to inhabit. A wife outside the spotlight, a mother to Natasha, her daughter born during a period when Susan tried to slow the pace of her life. The child's presence was not redemptive in any sentimental sense, but it introduced a new axis in her life, one where value was no longer measured by box office numbers or degrees of controversy. That small family functioned as a counterstructure to a world that had repeatedly rejected her. The pressure did not disappear. It merely changed shape. Susan still carried the injuries accumulated from an early age, while Claude, by nature a man of structure and rational order, could not always reach those fractured emotional zones. The distance between them did not stem from betrayal or surface-level drama, but from living at different rhythms, one seeking order to survive, the other long accustomed to surviving within instability. That sustained tension gradually turned the marriage into an enclosed space where silence carried more weight than speech. When the relationship ended in the early 1970s, there was no public climax for the media to seize upon. Just a family dissolving quietly, leaving Susan once again facing a familiar choice: attempt to re-enter the prescribed molds or hold on to withdrawal as a form of self-defense. Her subsequent return to roles that were increasingly demanding, increasingly uncompromising, cannot be separated from this marital experience, an attempt that taught her that even private life, when built on fragile ground, can become another form of pressure, subtle yet enduring. The breakup with Claude did not push Susan back into the familiar orbit of relationships swallowed by Hollywood's power structures, but it left behind a very real void. The need to connect with someone who did not stand above her, did not manage her image, did not treat her as a risk to be controlled. It was in that void that Dudley Moore appeared, someone who did not carry the imprint of the studio system, nor belong to the category of Hollywood men accustomed to setting the rules. Dudley came from a different world. He was a classically trained musician as well as a British comic actor known for self-mockery, irreverence, and sharp irony. In Susan, he did not see a troubled star or a controversial symbol, but a keen intelligence, a woman long accustomed to living under strain. Their relationship did not begin with secrecy or caution, but with a rare sense of resonance between two people who stood off-center from Hollywood in very different ways. Their marriage took place in the mid-1970s, at a moment when Dudley's career in the United States was rapidly accelerating, while Susan was entering a phase of acting that was more inward-looking, less performative. The family formed within an asymmetrical rhythm, one partner becoming increasingly sought after, the other deliberately maintaining distance from the spotlight. The birth of their son gave Susan a different kind of anchor, not romanticized or redemptive, but concrete and tangible, a responsibility that helped keep her grounded amid constant shifts. The pressure in this marriage did not come from the press or from past scandals, but from the misalignment of two lives moving at different speeds. Dudley, with his relentless schedule and continuous performance energy, was gradually drawn into the very machinery Susan had spent years trying to escape. Distance emerged without loud arguments. One person lived through stage lights and attention. The other had learned to survive through withdrawal. The difference did not explode into public drama, but eroded the shared life slowly and persistently. When the marriage ended in the late 1970s, Susan did not step forward as someone abandoned, nor did she attempt to retell the story as a personal tragedy. Her experience with Dudley left a mark unlike those of earlier relationships. Not exclusion by power, but the realization that even love without domination can become a form of collision when two people no longer share the same rhythm of existence. From that point on, the choice to further narrow her private life and to retain control over her distance from the outside world became increasingly evident in how Susan moved forward. After her marriage to Dudley Moore, Susan did not seek another partner from the worlds of theater or film. Past experiences had taught her that the spotlight, whether from Hollywood or from comedy, always carried a form of intrusion that was difficult to contain. It was precisely for that reason that the appearance of Pinchas Zukerman felt entirely different. Order, discipline, and a world in which value was established through technique and quiet labor, not public image. Zukerman was a renowned violinist and conductor in the classical music world, accustomed to concert halls, full scores, and demanding cycles of rehearsal. Their meeting took place at a time when Susan had already withdrawn significantly from Hollywood, gravitating toward spaces that felt less judgmental. This relationship did not grow from impulsiveness or scandal-driven attraction, but from a very specific need: to live within a structure where rules were clear, where emotion was not constantly exposed to public scrutiny. Their marriage reflected that effort. Their shared life was highly disciplined, revolving around performance schedules, rehearsals, extended tours, and a rhythm measured by music rather than media attention. The child born during this marriage expanded the sphere of responsibility, but also exposed the growing divergence between the two partners. For Zukerman, a musical career demanded near-total presence and focus. For Susan, motherhood became intertwined with a need for quiet and control over her living environment, something she had learned very late in life. The conflict did not erupt into public tragedy, but accumulated within differences of rhythm and survival needs. Classical music, despite its refined and elevated exterior, proved in practice to be no less demanding than any other entertainment industry. Susan came to realize that she was once again standing beside a system that required absolute priority. Only this time, the Hollywood spotlight had been replaced by the lights of the symphony stage. The sense of being pushed to the margins no longer came from Hollywood, but from the very structure of life she had chosen as an escape. The marriage ended quietly, without spectacle or lengthy public explanations. What remained was a silent confirmation. No matter how many worlds she attempted to enter, Susan kept encountering the same boundary. When shared life began to demand the surrender of control over her own rhythm of existence. From this point forward, the tendency to withdraw from long-term binding structures in both career and personal life became increasingly clear in the way she chose to live. After her marriages gradually came to an end, Susan's silence no longer carried the shape of escape. It felt instead like a decision that had been considered for a very long time. She still appeared sporadically in carefully chosen projects, was still invited, still mentioned by name, but she no longer allowed either her career or her private life to be pulled back into the familiar cycle of consumption. It was in this state of being both present and absent that Tuesday Weld's legacy slowly took shape. Not loudly, not framed by box office numbers or magazine covers, but by performances whose aftershocks outlasted their moment of release. The characters she embodied were never comforting, never easy to love, and never designed to reassure an audience. From the chilling gaze in Pretty Poison, to the haunting emptiness of Play It As It Lays, to the seemingly small yet unforgettable moments in Looking for Mr. Goodbar and Once Upon a Time in America, Susan did not perform in order to be accepted. She acted as if peeling back the very layers of defense she had been forced to build in order to survive. Over time, critics began to understand that what made her difficult to market was precisely what made her work endure: a refusal to soften emotion to suit the comfort of the majority. Susan's near-total withdrawal from Hollywood, no memoir, no talk shows, no extended explanations, accidentally reinforced a rare image in American film history. An actress who once stood very close to the center, but deliberately unplugged the light when she understood the price it demanded. The media labeled her Hollywood's ghost, but from another perspective, that absence marked the trace of someone who refused to be forever defined by labels imposed when she was far too young to choose. Susan Weld's legacy, then, does not lie in how many major roles she turned down or how many chances she missed to become a superstar. It lies in proving that talent does not always walk hand in hand with the ambition to dominate, and that sometimes the act of keeping silence for oneself is a form of power. Looking back on that journey, one does not see a complete story in the conventional sense, but a life carefully stitched together piece by piece, through choice, withdrawal, and performances deep enough to require no further explanation. What makes Tuesday Weld different is not how early she left Hollywood, but how she refused to let that world decide who she had to become. She understood the cruelty of the spotlight, but she never learned to be cruel in return. She carried trauma, but never turned it into a weapon for attention. She chose silence not out of weakness, but because she no longer wished to keep paying with herself. In an industry that rewards exposure, that choice is both rare and costly. Today, when people speak of Tuesday Weld, they do not remember only Pretty Poison, Play It As It Lays, or Looking for Mr. Goodbar. They remember a woman who stood very near the summit, yet kept the right to step back when the price no longer felt worth paying. Without mythologizing, without a late-life revival, her presence remains as a weighted pause, reminding us that talent does not always need to shout to be recognized. If you were once haunted by the cold stare in Pretty Poison, if you found yourself unable to look away from the emptiness of Play It As It Lays, if you've come to understand that some people choose silence not because they lack courage, but because they know too well the cost of glory, leave a word for Tuesday Weld, who spent her life protecting the right not to be defined by the spotlight. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring quiet journeys like this. Stories of people who lived honestly, even when the light was no longer shining on them.